Sport Business. Global Sports Intelligence.
Hello and welcome back to the Sport Business Podcast, getting you up to speed with the stories powering the global sports industry. I'm Catherine Davies, your podcast host, and this week, Imran Yusuf, fresh from his weekend at the German Super Cup in Stuttgart, is here to give us his expert insight into the Bundesliga and how it is working to differentiate itself as a brand through marketing, media, and technology. And a quick update on this section, I recorded it with Imran the day before the Bundesliga's multi-platform approach in the UK and Ireland was announced, with deals signed with Sky, the BBC, Amazon Prime Video, and most eye-catchingly, with Mark Goldbridge's That's Football YouTube channel. Later in the podcast, we're going to pick up on the growing trend for these hybrid rights sales. We'll also look at how Brazilian media giant Globo is starting its own YouTube football channel to make up ground on the perennial disruptor, Kazé TV. I'll also be joined by Matthew Glendinning and Martin Ross to talk about the news that emerged last week that the organisers of the Los Angeles Olympic Games in 2028 will be able to sell naming rights to host venues, a landmark departure from the International Olympic Committee's clean venues policy. We'll discuss the impact that could have not just on LA28's revenues, but whether future hosts will want the same deal and how it could affect, or not, the integrity of the Olympic sponsorship model. To all our listeners, don't forget to leave us your feedback in a review on the Apple Podcast or Spotify platforms, and let us know if you like what you're hearing and what you'd like to know more about. And now, moving straight into the first topic of the day. Imran Yusuf, our sport business media editor, is on the line with me now. Welcome back to the podcast, Imran. It's been a while, hasn't it? It's always good to have you on the show.
Thanks, Catherine. Great to be here.
I understand you're freshly back from Stuttgart, which is, of course, the home of Mercedes and Porsche, among other things. Were you there to visit their museums?
I was not, Catherine, tempting as they were. Cars are not really my thing, but I will come back to those two giant global car brands in a bit. Now, I was in Stuttgart for the German Super Cup. That's with the league champions Bayern against Stuttgart, who won the DFB Pokal last season. It's actually now been branded the Franz Beckenbauer Super Cup. This is the first year of that, after Der Kaiser, of course, who died last year. There were some rumours, and I was there, that the competition, having it named after him, had been the great man's dying wish, but those unconfirmed, I have to say. You know, the match itself wasn't scintillating. Bayern came out 2-1 winners, sort of a pre-season feeling. But really, I was there to learn more about Stuttgart, the club, and most of all about the DFL, the German Football League, their plans for international growth, which they do through their Bundesliga international subsidiary. Really interesting stuff. I mean, the Bundesliga is in an interesting place. It's a domestic powerhouse. It's the number 2 in the world in terms of football leagues. And their new rights cycle actually starts this weekend. We're recording this on Tuesday the 19th, so the weekend coming. 4-year deals, slight increase, around 2%, Sky remaining as the main broadcaster. That was a very solid result. It's internationally where they're a real sort of challenger property, obviously behind the Premier League, but also La Liga, which has detailed in your in focus, has, linguistic, cultural ties, player ties to the Americas. That's where a huge chunk of La Liga's media rights revenues come from. So the Bundesliga in this environment, where doing deals is not as automatic as previously happened. It's working hard. They're definitely working hard to build new fans and also eke as much value as they can from the world. So they're still competitive compared to other leagues. And they do this, and they really outline this to us there sort of in 3 main ways, I'd say, the way they sort of differentiate themselves, the Bundesliga brand. The first thing is they have this tagline, football as it's meant to be. Now, they mean on the pitch, but also off it. And to be fair to them, I think they do walk the walk pretty well. You might have heard of, the 50+1 rule, which means members of a club have to hold at least, 50%, and then the +1 refers to the voting right. Basically make sure the fans own the club. They're the majority. They decide. And even at the Super Cup match, there was an expression of this ethos. There was a big banner in the corner. They love their banners in Germany. And if you forgive my German, I think it said, DFL und Vereine, wir haben euch im Blick. 51 ausnahmlos umsetzen. And I think that means, well, I asked the guy next to me in the press box, it means the DFL and clubs, we've got our eyes on you. 50+1 needs to be implemented without exceptions. As it happens, there are a couple of exceptions, Wolfsburg, Leverkusen, and that's to do with the longevity of their investment. But by and large, 50+1 holds, and it's a big part of the Bundesliga brand about who owns the clubs, who owns the league. Very important. I think the second thing Bundesliga would say is about the atmosphere of the stadia. They're big on that. They do have the highest average attendances in any league in the world. Even their second division is one of the top ones. But more than the numbers, they talk about the atmosphere. Per Norbert, who's the CEO of Bundesliga International, met up with him over the weekend. And he will say that, international broadcasters, when they talk to him, the first thing they talk about is the atmosphere. Borussia Dortmund's, yellow wall, that thing which does translate as an audio visual experience. I think the third thing is really the football. They want it to be fast, attacking. They're really proud that they have more goals per game of any of the top leagues. It was 3.1 per game last season. I think none of the others, Premier League, Serie A, La Liga, etc., had above 3. Now, whether that's a reflection of the quality of their strikers or bad goalkeepers, up to you to decide. But those 3 main ways are how they sort of differentiate their brand.
So you talk about the brands, those brand differentiators. Do they translate into numbers commercially?
Yeah, I spoke to Bundesliga a couple of years ago, and they were targeting 300 million euros a year in their commercial revenues internationally. I think they're still a bit short of that. And there's a few big deals. Actually, Bundesliga have been very busy this summer with late deals, keeping us busy reporting on them. I think MENA, certainly at the time of recording, is not done. That's an important deal for them. I think it probably will be done by the weekend coming when our listeners might be hearing this. China's another important area. What they've done is, looked at multifaceted approach. We've reported on Brazil a lot before, and they have 8 broadcasters there, I think. They're doing something similar in the UK, which again, yet to be announced, but we're hearing interesting things about what could happen there. And Brazil, they say their revenues have tripled and audiences doubled since adopting this sort of multi-broadcaster approach. So they'll be looking at those kinds of successes in the UK and elsewhere. And generally, we're seeing a lot of that. Look at the La Liga UK deal, for example, more sort of fragmenting of the rights. I would say, though, that 50+1 fan culture, it's much of a football romantic as we are. I think it might hold them back a bit. And they might also say this in terms of growing the brand. They would love those more marketing dollars, basically, to help sell the product globally. And what would have helped them with that was private equity investment. But, our readers would have followed this over the last year or two. There were talks. The decision was put to the league. Ultimately, CVC's bid, it was CVC, which was the last one left, sole one left in the process. It didn't go through. And that's not because the DFL or indeed most of the club executives were not in favor. The fans simply didn't want it. And as we've discussed, the fans have their way. And, the DFL wasn't selling a stake in themselves, or there was no suggestion 50+1 would be removed. It was just for a share in a commercial vehicle, like La Liga adopts, like League One does. But ultimately, as I said, that was rejected. And it's interesting, that the match, the ultras stay away from this Super Cup match throughout Germany, wherever it's held. And the reason they do is they say it's not really a proper match. It's just a commercial vehicle, they say, for the DFL. And yet at the same time, if the DFL was to take this Super Cup to Tokyo, to New York, leave alone Riyadh, where it could help unlock more commercial revenues, they'd be instantly accused of sort of selling the soul of the German game. So they can't win in a way, sympathies with the DFL. Playing a match abroad generally, I think, La Liga are in the process of doing that. Serie A, Premier League said last week, it's not on their desk or being thought about. I think we can't categorically rule that out in the future. I think Frank last week talked about that, particularly with a US media rights deal coming up in a year or two. The Bundesliga, though, I think we can say that's not going to happen. I mean, there are a few certainties in football, let alone in life, but I think one of them, unless the average German football fan has a massive personality transplant, is not going to play a league game abroad.
Well, that's interesting because certainly here in Canada, I don't think the Bundesliga registers nearly as much as the other 4 leagues and even the French league because of the French component here. But moving on to VfB Stuttgart itself, beyond Bayern and Dortmund, who of course we saw in the FIFA Club World Cup last month, and perhaps now Leverkusen after their incredible success the season before last, other Bundesliga clubs tend not to register too much on the global radar. How are Stuttgart trying to change that?
Yeah, they're looking internationally. They're an interesting club. We spoke to Simon Gerbisch, who's their head of international business. He says they got 5 target markets. That's the US, Brazil, India, China, and Japan. And they do a lot. For example, with India, they've been working with the government and also local industry to try and sort of boost ties while also boosting the profile of the club. Also met up with Ruven Kasper, who's the CMO of Stuttgart. Quite interesting, actually, because as we were sort of talking, there are a lot of rumors in the German press that Bayern wanted to poach him to come to their commercial team. At the same time, Nick Woltemade, who's Stuttgart's probably best player, he's a 6'5" striker. Bayern have also been after him. I think they've had 3 bids rejected at the time of us talking. Maybe by the time people listen here, would have been sold. So it's interesting, both on the pitch and off, Bayern doing what they do and trying to use their muscle. And, ultimately, that's what Bayern do. And Jürgen Klinsmann, the great German legend, met up with him. Amazing person, actually, pretty magnetic. But he actually grew up in that region, played for Stuttgart, of course, also played for Bayern. The way he called it, he said, look, this is what Bayern do. And ultimately, others calm themselves down a bit, realize that Bayern have managed to successfully commercialize themselves. They're still playing 50 by 1 in a way that the others perhaps aspire to. I think Stuttgart definitely does aspire. Klinsmann himself said Stuttgart's something of an underperforming side, maybe a sleeping giant. The region, Baden-Württemberg is a massive of manufacturing, very wealthy. And that brings us back to Porsche and Mercedes, who actually each of them has 10.4% ownership of the club. So they're both on the board. These competitors work together when it comes to the football team. And I think Simon, the head of international business, told us that when they were doing some activation in Atlanta, and the guys out in America couldn't believe that these two commercial rivals would actually do an activation together. It was sort of unfathomable to him. But I think in the best spirit of sort of German compromise and consensual working together, they came through that. The arena as well is called the MHP Arena. That's a Porsche company. I think it used to be Mercedes. Having Porsche labels on the stadium, I think wouldn't have gone down well given they're such rivals. So again, German compromise won the day.
One thing that the Bundesliga does very well, among the many things they do well, is technology. They're a very tech-forward league, aren't they? I think they were the first to do the 9x16 orientation back in 2019. La Liga was talking about doing that, but that was only 2 or 3 years ago. And Bundesliga were at it in 2019. Did they show off any of their new features or gadgets at this game?
They did. Yeah, they love to do that. You're right. They are sort of at the forefront of a lot of these innovations. They showed us their F-Cam, which was sort of filed last year, this year, full-scale rollout. Viewers will be familiar with that from the Club World Cup. They showed us this AI chatbot that fans, I think, will soon be able to use, which basically has all DFL data going back to, the 1940s, 50s, whatever. So if you wanted to look up all the specific details about, say, Bayern versus Stuttgart, that'll come with an AI chatbot. Semi-automated offside this year as well. And then there was also these guys from live.com. It must have been an expensive domain name purchase. They showed off the virtual reality sort of headset. Actually, they don't make the headset. They do the software and they do the cameras inside the stadium. And apparently those cameras transmit 1.5 terabytes per minute. That I've been assured that that's a lot. First time I'd worn one and sort of tried it out. And I have to say, although it felt a bit dizzy afterwards, it was pretty mesmerizing. I can see myself, if I find a spare sort of $5,000 using one of those in the future.
Imran, you mentioned about the international media rights before, and they get by far, I think it's close to 85% of their media rights revenues comes from domestic revenues. But you've written in the past month or so about quite a number of deals that have been concluded, some of them for significant increases. Maria, our colleague, wrote about the increases in Russia where the fee doubled. That's got an interesting twist to it because the money is donated to humanitarian aid. But I think there was a rise in Turkey that was close to doubling. So it seems that they are really making some headway in getting new deals, renewing deals with strong partners. What do you think? Are they going to be earning a greater percentage from international fees this time?
I think it is. I think they're, as I said, they're creative in how they package the rights. They're creative in having multiple partners. And we've seen that also in Japan. Again, today, as we record this, their second partner in Japan was announced. That's Abema to go with the DAZN. So again, not just one broadcaster as there had been previously in Japan, which is quite a big market for the Bundesliga, given how many Japanese players there are there and the sort of history. So again, I think when you talk to them, they're a forward-looking bunch. They very much see themselves as a sort of challenger brand and almost enjoy that position as a challenge and an opportunity. And so I'm sure they'll get some more good deals over the line.
Well, there is certainly a personal note about the Bundesliga here in Canada where I am, because particularly in Vancouver, because Thomas Müller, who played for Bayern Munich for 17 years, I believe, just signed a couple of weeks ago with the Vancouver Whitecaps of Major League Soccer. And he nearly scored the most magnificent debut goal, but it was disallowed for being offside. But that's a big deal. He's one of the biggest names to play in the Vancouver Whitecaps. And so I think that really helps. It's a smart move. I don't know how the move was instigated. I did hear that he was a bit of a mentor for our Alphonso Davies, who's the Canadian national team star, who, of course, was his teammate at Bayern. And there may have been something there with agents encouraging Müller to play out his retirement years in Vancouver, which is a very nice place to live. But there was a huge welcome for him in Vancouver. And I think that, plus Alphonso Davies still playing in Bayern, will really help to raise awareness of the Bundesliga and perhaps make it more popular. And people can now find it on DAZN and Fubo TV because they've just done a joint agreement there to have the two services available to subscribers of each. And so, yeah, I think those kind of things would really help. Do you see that in other countries, or is that
trying to export their players in their golden years to play and raise awareness?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing more of that. I think they do it, largely for their own personal reasons, but as a byproduct is they do act as ambassadors for the league, for the country. Muller, for sure, sort of lives and breathes Bundesliga and also Bayern. We spoke to Claudio Pizarro as well, who played for Bayern, played for a number of other clubs, including Chelsea, I think, briefly. And he talked about Muller and the sort of hole that'll be for Bayern to fill, because he was such a strong personality in the dressing room, sort of lifted everyone. But you guys over there, Catherine in Vancouver, will be able to enjoy him, in the flesh.
That's right. And there's a strong German community here. So I can imagine there'll be perhaps some Bundesliga themed events or homages to German football. And he's a big star. So it's quite exciting. And what a shame that goal was ruled offside, because it would have been one of the most extraordinary debut goals in Major League Soccer history. Well, moving right along. Imran, thank you very much. I'm glad you enjoyed the Super Cup game. What a chance to go and be there in Stuttgart. We'll be seeing you in future podcasts, I'm sure, very soon. Thanks very much, and we'll be moving right along. We'll be right back.
For a weekly roundup of the biggest stories shaping global sport, sign up to the Weekly Digest, our free newsletter packed with essential insights. Subscribe at sportbusiness.com.
Welcome back to the Sport Business Podcast, bringing you the latest sport business industry news. In this segment of the podcast, I'm talking to our European sponsorship editor, Matthew Glendinning, and global news editor, Martin Ross, about a topic that has sparked heated debate, namely the fact that the International Olympic Committee has allowed the organizers of the 2028 Games in Los Angeles to sell naming rights to Olympic and Paralympic venues. Welcome, Matthew and Martin. Now, Matthew, let's start with you. There's been a very strong reaction to this from some sides, hasn't there? Some people have gotten very upset about what they perceive as a compromise to the clean venue concept. Is that a reasonable reaction?
I wonder if it's a bit of a confected reaction, actually, Catherine. I think a lot of media people in particular, when they get hold of a sports business story, they tend to sort of gnash their teeth when anything that seems to break with tradition happens. Anything that happens at Wimbledon, anything there was, oh my goodness, and I think there's a bit of that from the media. There is, however, some rational business concerns. I think one of the experts, Ricardo Fort, said that if he was advising a top sponsor, a worldwide partner on this, that he might complain to the IOC because it might dilute their presence. But I was kind of surprised that most people thought, actually, this is important for for LA28, who do have to raise their budget from entirely private sources, and B, it's in a market that is heavily laden with naming rights, and people think of these venues as through these corporate names, and to kind of give that inventory up to some stakeholders in LA28 and indeed the top sponsors who can also buy some of the temporary venue inventory is a pretty good idea. And more than that, the key thing is that the field of play is still a clean field of play. You're not going to see any branding around the action. It's all going to be behind the scenes.
I think that's what most of the people we've spoken to, or that I've seen certainly, they tend to agree with that position. There's just one position I'd like to bring up, Patrick Nally, who's known as an early pioneer of sports marketing, and he thinks that this risks a slippery slope that could dilute the carefully guarded approach that's been upheld all these years, and that the integrity of the sponsorship model is crucial, and that is at stake. You think that's the risk. What do you think of that?
Well, for a start, I think it may only be for the LA Games that this happens. It could be particular to the US market, and that kind of allows for this kind of innovation in the US. It might not work anywhere else. But I think a lot of experts have actually been much more exercised by other things that the IOC have allowed, or the local organisers have allowed. For example, in Paris, LVMH had about 5 minutes of product placement during the opening ceremony. Samsung was allowed to provide medalists with phones to take selfies on the podium when they won a medal. And I think some people find that, Michael Payne for one, more egregious than this, which seems quite a pragmatic effort to help the LA28 organisers. And the fact is that people will think of those stadia, at least in the US, by their corporate names, because that's what they always thought of them as.
Mm-hmm. Martin, do you agree with that? Do you think there'll be...
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. I would disagree with Patrick, actually. I think from a very broader point of view, an Olympic top sponsorship has changed so much over that time. I mean, if we go back that far, The crux of it was the rings, your association with the rings, your ability to put the rings on your product, whether that's Coca-Cola, whoever it may be. And that activation in between the games was really important. I think so much has changed now in the consumption of content, what a sponsor expects in terms of exposure, but also content that not necessarily that they might put out, but the Samsung example, the sort of subtle branding. We can have an argument about how subtle the LVMH branding was in the opening ceremony, but maybe you look back to London 2012 and the minis, the BMW owned minis that were used on the field of play. I think it is fundamentally important to move everything forward to a far more kind of modern set of inventory. Otherwise, you run the risk of losing your sponsors to a other premium rights holder who is going to offer them bells and whistles of everything they want. So naming rights specifically, as this is an opportunity, I think is a kind of logical extension of the various more subtle elements that the IOC has been rolling out, I think, in recent editions, more so since Tokyo, actually, with the backdrop on venue press conferences.
Well, I just to say, I would add that LA28 obviously put the IOC under pressure to, or at least negotiate this with the IOC. And they needed it, I think, because there are some very important naming rights partners who perhaps will come on board as top-tier partners, paying maybe a 9-figure fee if they're allowed to use their naming rights, particularly the SoFi Stadium. So SoFi is a fintech. And the SoFi Stadium normally shows NFL, but for the games, it will have the opening ceremony shared with the Memorial Coliseum. And it will also have, believe it or not, swimming. It's going to be turned into a swimming theatre. And you can imagine that for the many days of swimming that is on, the amount of mention SoFi Stadium might get, if they are allowed to do that, would be considerable. And I think probably my intuition is that SoFi, Crypto.com, the Crypto.com arena, maybe the Intuit Dome, which will be showing the basketball. I've got a feeling that might have been a stumbling block for those brands to come on as top-tier sponsors, and that this might sort of unblock that money.
Interesting question is it a one-off? If we ask the IOC about this, and or the IOC's position on this, I think is that they are reviewing it essentially. Going forwards, they will see how this goes. I don't think it will be an off, personal opinion. I look at a modern, not as naming rights aren't ubiquitous in Australia the same way they are in the States, but it would be in your top 7 or 8 maybe markets around the world. You look at maybe the Suncorp Stadium in Brisbane, which will be a venue. I think there'll be football preliminaries at the Alliance Stadium in Sydney. If you're a host now, you look at this and go, well, I want that too. Or if you are a prospective host, and it's now become all about negotiation between the IOC and prospective hosts, it's not a bidding process per se. You go into this saying, well, actually, I would, I'd like a piece of this as well. So and if you look at all the other things they've implemented carefully over recent iterations, none of them, to my knowledge, have gone away. We talk about Samsung, the selfies, we talk about the backdrops at the venue press conferences since Tokyo, little bits of field of play stuff. None of that has sort of been reversed. So I also think the actual financial impact of this, I think it adds weight to potential sponsorships going forward, but the actual financial impact of a 2-week temporary sponsorship that a top would take up, I don't think will be huge. I think it's just important revenue coming in as additional revenue to the OCOG. I think it's maybe been slightly overplayed, and the reaction by some I don't think is commensurate to the actual value that some of the temporary deals will be.
Who's actually going to be buying these naming rights? Is it the worldwide top sponsors, existing venue naming rights like SoFi, as you mentioned, or will it be a new set of domestic sponsors? Who's going to pick up these, or is it reserved for a certain group or highest bidder?
I think SoFi and Crypto.com will come in, and potentially Intuit as well. So I'm sticking my neck out there. I think there may also be some new domestic sponsors who might take temporary. The temporary venues, I agree with Martin, do not look as tempting as some of these other opportunities. And if, by the way, SoFi and Crypto.com decide not to into a deal with LA28, those venues, they won't be offered to anyone else. So a top can't come in and have the sort of stadium for the opening ceremony. It will be called, I think it's going to be called 2028 Stadium, the SoFi Stadium, if no one comes in. The temporary venues, there's 19 of them, for kayaking, that sort of level of event. I'm not sure who would come in for that. I don't think they're worth a lot on their own. And if you have to buy a tier 1 sponsorship, which could be, 100 million in order to get a temporary venue, I don't think that's really going to be very tempting. There's one thought I had was that if one top came in, say Allianz, which has a history of being a naming rights sponsor, I can imagine that the rest of them coming in. Okay, you've got kayaking, we'll do a bit of, let's say for the sake of argument, boxing, and maybe they might even make an agreement to have one each. So something to look out for, that maybe if one top comes in, the rest might come in just because it looks like a bit of extra. But as someone said to me, if you buy a top sponsorship, you're really looking to get all the ROI on that sponsorship back before the games even begins. So this is really just an add-on, not particularly valuable on its own, valuable if it's included in a sponsorship that includes media buy with NBC, but not on its own. And it won't also be allowed. You can't sell it to the local butcher. It has to be sold to a tier one sponsor. So it's all bundled into that value. But I'm predicting SoFi and Crypto.com come in. Potential domino effect amongst the tops. I wouldn't know what other domestic sponsors will come in, but it seems possible they might.
So the LA budget is, I think it's been pegged at about 7.1 billion. And I heard that they're about 3/4 of the way there. And as you said, all of their budget has to come from the private sector. There's no billions from the government coming LA's way. How much money can this venue naming deal, how much can it realistically make for LA28, do you think? Can it cover that gap that's still remaining?
Yeah, Michael Payne, who was ambivalent, let's say, about the venue naming rights, but not against it, and does believe in the clean field. He did nevertheless say that he didn't think it was going to be worth that much. He said he would be astonished if LA28 made 1% of their budget back from this initiative, which their budget being about 7 billion, so that's about 70 million to 80 million. Of course, that's if you're only looking at it as a sort of pure naming rights play. If you see it as bait or an important bit of a jigsaw for someone to come in for $100 million sponsorship, a tier one sponsorship, then it sort of has a bit more value, even though you can't quite separate that from the value of the tier one sponsorship. So, and as I say, what would be the worst thing that could happen is if you hear that these sponsorships are being sold off for 5 million or 2 million here and there, like a bit of a fire sale, that would look incredibly cheap. But as far as I know, the rules will be sealed that you have to be a tier one sponsor. You can't be a tier three supporter who just has an extra 2 million or 3 million to spend. So we shall see. If it brings in the big fish, though, I think it will have been worth the exercise.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I don't think the IOC would dispute, I don't know whether they dispute the specific numbers or not, but I don't think they feel that they've uncovered a gold mine here of new revenue for the OC. I think it just fits in with the wider narrative around helping host cities get the games pay for, making the games be able to pay for themselves. That, to me, is the rationale behind this, along with a recognition of the US market being strong kind of naming rights market and quite not unique in that sense, but just the way it operates. There's a logistical argument and a sustainability argument. I don't know if I buy it entirely around all the work that has to be done around, putting tarpaulin on big venues to cover up existing logos, not having to generate lots of additional, change in that way. But I suppose that argument has been going on forever. And if you look at the World Cup or the Euros, any major event, this has to happen. But clearly, and rightly so, sustainability has become more important in terms of changes that have to be made. But yeah, I don't believe that to be the main reason. Clearly, the main reason would be financial.
Well, Martin, you mentioned before about you think that future organisers may want to negotiate their own deals with the IOC. And do you think about a naming rights sponsorship and so forth? Do you think that organising committees in the future are going to be more aggressive in stretching the IOC's marketing rules?
Yeah, I'll let Matthew come in maybe specifically on LA28 and that relationship with the IOC. I suppose it's always been marriage of convenience, that relationship between an OCOG and the IOC. But yeah, this clearly will be a green flag for future organising committees because they'll see this as an opportunity commercially and they'll be licking their lips a bit, as they should be. But I don't see why the IOC won't be in favour of negotiating around a repeat of this in due course. They don't do stuff sort of rashly. We can maybe discuss the sort of field of play changes in a minute. But yeah, that relationship's not always the easiest though, Matthew.
Obviously, the IOC and the organising committees now can negotiate stuff. It's not just the tablet sent down from the mountain for the organising committee as it used to be. And I think some people, Ricardo Fort indeed, he thought that this was really quite a creative process. It was a creative tension. It was much better that the organising committees were innovative, even aggressive, he said, in order to kind of create new inventory or new activation programs. And he said that's a much more healthy situation than sort of, organising committees being passive. And I think, as Martin said, I think we're just going to see more and more of these kind of discussions. Nothing set exactly in stone, although I'd say obviously the thing we talked about earliest in the podcast about the clean field of play, that's non-negotiable. But a lot of things are negotiable. I think it was a pragmatic solution to the specifics of the US market. And I'm sure that there'll be more negotiations to come in the future.
And it's clear that the costs of organising an Olympic Games, they've skyrocketed over the past couple of decades, and it's very difficult to find a host that can meet those costs. So this is one way to lure them into perhaps realising that they can make that budget happen, they can meet their requirements. Because, LA is one thing, and they have the commercial success from 1984 when they basically created the commercial model, didn't they? But other cities might not find it as appealing, and certainly the consumers, the people, the citizens in the cities don't want to have all their tax dollars going to a multi-sport event like this.
I think the Winter Games will be a different argument altogether as well. Obviously you have sliding centres, you have curling centres. Certain ice hockey venues in certain big markets will have, big naming rights deals. But yeah, you're not going to be slapping a logo on a mountain. So yeah, I think this is more of a Summer Olympics discussion. I think it gets really tasty when we start talking about what a clean field of play is, what is the red line. I think some people here have suggested that this is the red line that has been crossed. I disagree with that, actually. I think the red line, and I don't think the IOC would go anywhere near this, is LED pitchside boards and brands in sight or actually on the field of play. I think that is the red line. I don't see that happening anytime soon, and I think that would be super controversial. I think the IOC gets held, probably rightly so, I suppose, to a different standard from other rights holders. If you look at Wimbledon, its sort of clean field of play has been not compromised, but made subtle additions over the last 10 years, 15 years. The IOC's always had some brands on the field of play. Omega on scoreboards, I don't know how long it's been. I don't know. You could go back several decades and see Omega branding. You could see, as I said, the minis at London, or you could see Panasonic televisions, which now be TCL televisions. So it's all part of, as I said, I think for them, finding ways that they can provide more values to tops as to generate more money in very simplistic terms. We've seen that with Samsung. We've seen that with Coca-Cola, which had, I was going to say Coke parties. They held Coke. I think I'll say Coca-Cola parties, just to specify that I do mean Coca-Cola, around the torch relay. So it's kind of bringing that fan-facing sort of authenticity, I think, for them, that a modern sponsor of a top-tier event would expect. So that's why, in my view, it's changed so much over time. And I would maybe disagree with a little bit the commentary there's been around the clean field of play. I think, as Matthew said, there's been a lot of buy-in around commentators for the actual naming rights development and a recognition that this is where the market is, and to be rejecting that source of revenue full stop would kind of be folly.
Well, we've been talking about the Olympics thus far, but do you think venue naming rights could become part of FIFA World Cup or UEFA Euro packages in the future?
That's an interesting one. My first instinct was, this will change things. And then the model for the FIFA partners and the UEFA partners is really embedded in a highly structured program where there's a standard set of rights. And there's a kind of clean venue in another sense. It's clean in that you only give all signage is carved out for those partners in very segmented, standardized ways. It would be very difficult, for example, to sell naming rights to any of those partners so that one partner was higher than the other, which would kind of defeat the whole object of sort of standardized packages. And then you've got the possibility of the stadiums just retaining their naming rights. But I think UEFA and FIFA both know how diluting that is for value for those partners. They, even in communications, for example, at UEFA club level, they won't call the Emirates Stadium, they'll call it Arsenal Stadium. They use generic names for the stadium because they don't want any interference whatsoever with the rights that those partners get. The interesting thing was that with the Club World Cup, I was just thinking, what did they do there? And I think because it was in the US, but partly because it was almost like created on the hoof. You had a very loose sense of what some partners got compared to other partners. They were quite happy to use the naming rights partners, and the final was at the MetLife Stadium. And it was in all the FIFA communications. There was no they didn't try to erase that or redact that. So, however, that tournament was, everything was at the last minute with that tournament. You didn't know who was doing what until, they decided to tally up at the end and said that they sold all their inventory. So I'm not sure. I think for FIFA and UEFA, especially for national team competitions, I don't think it's going to work. Maybe for lesser competitions. I mean, there was also the case recently that Allianz Stadium, or Twickenham Stadium as it used to be known, will be allowed to be called Allianz Stadium for the Women's Rugby World Cup. And they had to buy a sponsorship in order for that to happen. So you can't just pay the organising committee and say, we're just going to keep our naming rights. Thank you very much. You have to buy extra inventory and be sort of part of the programme. So maybe there's room for some partners that do up the ante, so they're not just paying to retain the naming rights, but they're paying for a fuller involvement in the programme. But I think it's problematic, and I don't see that happening.
It's funny you mentioned Twickenham. I think it's this and the IOC example. It is becoming a bit of a trend, and solutions are being found. If there's a will, there's a way. And it's the mention of Emirates reminds me of Glasgow 2014, which they did very well, Emirates, in terms of recognition, because they agreed to sponsor the arena here in the east end of Glasgow, which is attached to the velodrome, maybe just shortly before the games. And I'm sure I could go back and find maybe sort of commentary mentions of the Emirates Arena during the games. They kind of managed to bypass not the legislation, but they kind of got known as the Emirates during the event. Although the best bit about that game, and Catherine, you're going to struggle to find a segue from this, but the velodrome was the Sir Chris Hoy velodrome, which his name was fully attached to the venue, and arriving to work as a pundit during the Commonwealth Games, he was asked to provide his accreditation, which was back to front. And all he had to do was actually just put his point up to the building and say, well, that's my accreditation right there. But he was very polite about it. Anyway, entirely unrelated and a different multi-sports games. But there we go.
Well, I don't know that we'll be seeing what Terence Burns referred to as when he was urging people to go out and cover up brand names with duct tape back in the day. And certainly in the commentary, you can't vet all the commentary. People will say the names of stadiums, won't they? The original name. I think we've done a good job on this. We've covered it. Thank you both for your perspective and your insight on that. Matthew, Martin, great stuff. Good to have you on the show. And if you'd like to know more about the US naming rights market, Sport Business Sponsorship has recently published the Stadium Naming Rights Report, a comprehensive deep market analysis on the business of sports venue naming rights in North America, Europe, the UK, and the rest of the world. So head over to sportbusiness.com and to the sponsorship section to find out how to order that report. And now we'll take a short break before we move on to our final section, a look to what's new, interesting, and possibly amusing in the week ahead. We'll be right back.
Enjoying the conversation? Follow the Sport Business Podcast and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. And if you're finding it valuable, leave us a rating and a review to help others discover the show.
Welcome back to the Sport Business Podcast. We're moving into the final part of today's podcast, and I'm here with Martin Ross. Martin, we're looking ahead to what's going to be happening over the next 7 days, and I think we're going to refer to the first part where Imran talked about the Bundesliga, but we recorded that just before the news came out that the Bundesliga had signed some rather interesting media rights deals in the UK, and I think that has something to do with what's on your radar, isn't it? Yeah,
so we did a kind of teaser story recently about Sky renewing just for its 5:30 game and said that there would be other outlets. And then, in due course, those were announced earlier this week. Everybody's been talking about this on LinkedIn, on podcasts, etc. Some of the commentary I don't think's accurate. We'll come to that. But top line for people who haven't followed it is that Sky retains its 5:30 game exclusively, but that on a Sunday, Amazon will show on pay-per-view all the games there. In the UK, the BBC, interestingly, Champions League broadcaster in the UK, has picked up Friday night matches, but those will not be exclusive because they will also be streamed on YouTube by the Bundesliga. But then there's a package of 20 live games each for, and this is the very interesting bit, is the Overlap, which is a YouTube show with Gary Neville and other former footballers, and also Mark Goldbridge's That's Football YouTube channel will also show games. So it is, I've got various bees in my bonnet about this, but the first one to me is this is not revolutionary in the sense that this is the playbook the Bundesliga used 2 years ago in Brazil It's just the fact that it's in the UK that it's got so much attention. It is important, but yeah, the Bundesliga did this 2 years ago. Different markets are tracking at different paces. They did, I think, 7 broadcasters they had, including Kaze TV and GOAT on the YouTube side. This, to me, I don't think it's a revolutionary move. I would question the bravery of the move as well, in the sense that there was somebody put it on LinkedIn, I can't even remember who it was, posted on LinkedIn that Mark Goldbridge had taken on Sky and defeated them to win the Bundesliga rights. That is completely incorrect. The way these things work and the complexities of the tenders in the UK, La Liga's recent tender in the UK had 3 different iterations of the tender. So yeah, the Bundesliga goes to market in the UK. Clearly Sky is one of the first points of call. And from Sky's point of view, they have all this extra EPL on a Sunday, they have EFL, they have other leagues. They don't want any more, and with the way that the market has gone in terms of rights fee falls, they have no interest really in paying a premium to show exclusively all Bundesliga. So they have essentially cherry-picked, the game they want on economics that work for them, and then the Bundesliga would work around that, which is a pattern we've seen. Sorry, I'm getting excited now and ranting a little bit, but I feel passionately about it.
Well, I think it's interesting to see how the YouTube element has been repeated in other countries. And of course, we know about Kaze TV. What's interesting in Brazil is that Globo, the market giant there, the commercial broadcaster, they are launching their own YouTube football channel in 2 weeks' time. And the first match is going to be a Brazil versus Chile World Cup qualifier. And they're doing this, one commentator said, it's to dethrone Kaze TV, which has been, as we know, the perennial disruptor, as I said before. And it's really interesting why they're doing this and why they're doing it now, but also it just shows that there is a hybrid model of the distribution of rights, and people are looking at YouTube as a viable option to attract that younger demographic and the advertisers that go with them.
Yeah, and I think that hybrid still works at the moment. We discussed this in a previous podcast around Kaze TV, which listeners might want to check in on if they haven't. That kind of model is shifting though, and I think Kaze TV feels it's being, it is now being viewed as a kind of rights buyer in itself. So the nature of these deals will change over time in terms of the, minimum guarantees that the likes of a YouTuber would have to put down. But as it stands, this deal will clearly still be primarily financed by Sky. What's super interesting to me is that it's kind of a 2 fingers up to owned and operated. I mean, the Bundesliga, go back 5-6 years ago, was making a big thing of, I think, Bundesliga Pass, it was called, partly as a way to threaten's a bit strong, but make their rights holding broadcasters aware that they would be willing to go D2C in their own market. Now, yes, the Bundesliga is showing some games on YouTube here, but they've chosen not to go owned and operated, and they've looked at the traction on YouTube, which we know is huge, continues to be. Mark Goldbridge's channel is 1.4 million subscribers. The overlap is 1.5 million. So in a way, it is a recognition of that. But I think the really landmark development would be when a rights holder goes to market and say, right, okay, the market has changed so much. You've got a Sky who's no longer willing to put down. The days of them putting down over £20 million a year for La Liga rights, for example, are long, long gone. The economics of a deal with a big pay TV broadcaster in the UK or another market don't work for us. So what we're going to do is we're going to go all in on YouTube. Now, what kind of minimum guarantee will they get back for that? At the moment, not very much at all. And it'll be, primarily driven by rev share type agreements that can be negotiated. I think that was a success of Kaze TV in the early days, the kind of innovative revenue sharing deals they could negotiate with rights holders because the rights holders were desperate to get to this demographic. So let's see. I'll be really interested to see the viewing figures for all of this. But as I said, it is a continuation of a pattern of, in a difficult market, of going with a main broadcaster for a couple of games and then the rest going on something else. You look at La Liga, which did obviously the deal with Disney Plus for all the Saturday evening games, but Premier Sports retained a main package. You look at Serie A, where TNT remains the main broadcaster, but DAZN shows the other games, was One Football. Or you look at Amazon pay-per-view for League One in the UK, which was also, talk about owned and operated, that was the League One owned and operated, but that didn't last too long in the UK. So it is more evidence of a more disparate model. I think the Bundesliga should be applauded for doing it. But the risk is not all in because they still have their Sky deal.
Well, I think there's a lot to be discussed and said for this new hybrid model. And I'm thinking of the article we published this week about the Brazilian Championship, the Brasileirão, the top tier football league, and how the two different groups, they're not sold centrally. And 9 clubs sell their rights exclusively to Globo. And the other 11 have sold them to a wide range. They've sold them to Globo and to Amazon and to Record and Cazé TV. And those clubs are getting more money from that deal. So there is an argument that, spreading the riches will, in the end, be better for you. And we're looking at other examples in Latin America. Mexico, for example, the national team rights, which are sold by the Mexican Federation. They're working with Team Sports Marketing, and they are looking also at a hybrid model of selling to various platforms. And there is an example of that with the Mexican League, where Televisa is sharing one match per week of Club America, the biggest club, or one of the 2 biggest clubs, shall I say, with a YouTube broadcaster. So there's definitely a trend this way, isn't there, Martin? And it's not necessarily just to build a wider audience and bring in those young viewers and the advertisers that go with them. It's a revenue-driven opportunity, isn't it? Just thinking of Brazil.
I think, till now, Brazil's a really good example of kind of, Cazé TV and the Globo kind of stayed in their lanes, if you like, and it's kind of cooperated and it's worked quite well. The more and more, we've seen research around YouTube becoming, in some markets, the primary free-to-air / free-to-view viewing platform, or second in some markets. Then it becomes more of a difficult, I suppose, negotiation. In very simplistic terms, you're back to the old argument around, pay TV and free-to-air TV. How can packages be sort of divided up for both? So the dynamics will change the more eyeballs, I think, go to YouTube, and that's only going in one direction. So, it's going to be, let's come back in 3 years and see what they do next cycle. But I think the most telling point, and Imran reported on this week, the deals with the overlap and with Mark Goldbridge are just for one season. And the deals with BBC, with Sky and with Amazon are for 2 seasons.
So they're testing the waters, aren't they?
Exactly. So when we look at open up LinkedIn and it says landmark decision by Bundesliga to, totally embrace YouTube, it's not, but it is an interesting precursor to something perhaps more dramatic in the future.
One point I thought interesting about the Brazil situation is that Globo is going to be using some of its matches for the Brazil Serie A for its new YouTube channel. It'll show 16 matches from September to December. And some commentators were saying that they have to be really careful not to use the matches that are exclusive to Sport TV, or any matches. They're going to be showing other things, the Libertadores, the Copa do Brasil, and some national team qualifying matches. But if they use matches that would normally have been exclusive on their pay TV channel, then you could have a case where the pay TV platforms like Vivo and Claro, which carry Sport TV and rely on it, drive subscribers and to retain them at a time when subscriptions are plummeting. They're going to say, hey, why are we paying you so much money? And you're showing these matches free on YouTube. So there's a delicate balancing act there. Like the Vivo and Claro and all these platforms, Sky Brazil, they pay something like 3 to 4 billion reais a year, which is a lot of money. I can't do the exchange in my head, but it's a lot of money. And so why would they continue to pay that if their primary driver, the ESPN of Brazil, Sport TV, earns the biggest affiliate fees of any channel? And so why would they continue to pay that if those matches are free on YouTube?
Yeah, fully agree. And I'm going to put you on the spot to finish off and ask you,
oh dear,
if you're not in the UK, obviously you're in Canada, but if you were in the UK or if you were using a VPN, not recommending it, and you're settling down to watch some Bundesliga action on a Friday night, would you be watching on the BBC? Would you be watching Bundesliga's kind of official YouTube? Would you be watching the overlap? Or would you be watching That's Football with Mark Goldbridge? By that, I mean his channel, not watching it with him.
I'm tempted to look at what the YouTube influencers are doing. I'm fascinated by what they say about them, about how they've created a community and how the broadcast lasts much longer than the game. Often they're 3.5, 4 hours long because they're chatting before and after, and they're on screen during. And I'm actually quite curious to see what it's all about. So I think I'd be tempted to check out YouTube.
Me too for a couple of games, and then I'd be back in the BBC.
Well, that's good, Martin. Thank you so much. Do you have any other business for this section of the podcast?
Yes, Catherine. There's been a whole slew of kind of drink sponsorship recently in sport, specifically football. I don't know if people are drinking more than ever before. I don't know if we're back to the COVID days of lots of people drinking. I mean, it's a healthy market. I suppose healthy market, unhealthy people. But big champagne sponsorship this week. The champagne sponsor Piaf has done a deal which we hope they won't regret. Boom, boom. With, would you like to guess which leading football club?
Oh, I don't know. Manchester United, Paris Saint-Germain.
Close. Motherwell Football Club. Motherwell in Lanarkshire in Scotland. It's an exciting new partnership, I'm told, with the Loch Lomond Group owned Piaf, which kind of got my head racing. I thought that champagne brands had to emanate from the Champagne region. It turns out they do, so they obviously have some kind of licensing deal. Anyway, I just found it slightly odd that Piaf of the Champagne region would choose Motherwell as their latest sponsorship investment, but I think they have sponsored the Open before, and we love a sort of puffy PR quote, so we'll maybe finish with that from Ryan Head, the Champagne Piaf global brand manager. He said, "At Champagne Piaf, we celebrate passion, commitment and the joy of shared experiences." Well, I can confirm there's not many of those at Motherwell. And values, he didn't say that, I did. Values that resonate deeply with the spirit of Motherwell Football Club and its faithful supporters. So there we go. This partnership is not just about two brands coming together. It's about elevating moments both on and off the pitch. So there we go. The drinks, alcohol industry is alive and well, and the world of PR is also alive and well. So yeah, let's cheers to Motherwell.
That's rather a lovely way to end the podcast, I think. And if you want to know more about today's stories or any of our other reports and analyses, and especially if you're looking for the world's largest collection of accurate rights fees across media and sponsorship, you can take a look at subscription options on our website or get in touch with us via email at info@sportbusiness.com. If you enter the code SBPodcast30 at the checkout, you'll get a 30% discount on annual and monthly Sport Business subscriptions. You can also share your thoughts on this episode and give us your feedback in a review on the Apple Podcast or Spotify platform. And watch for our weekly LinkedIn post promoting the podcast, where you can, of course, leave a comment. Thank you all for tuning in, for reading, for subscribing. I'm Catherine Davies, and we'll be back again next week with the Sport Business Podcast.